COVID-19 has been disastrous for our economy and our productivity.
But it has caused us to reset, rethink, and innovate.
Productivity Awareness Week 2020 will focus on building collective resilience in tourism, infrastructure, and the financial sector.
Rethink our approach to the agriculture, manufacturing, and the health sector.
It calls for innovation in education and taking advantage of opportunities in the digital economy.
Telework for greater resilience and productivity.
Join the discussions during Productivity Awareness Week from October 12th to the 16th.
Under the theme, Building Resilience Through Collective Action.
Reset,
Rethink,
Innovate.
Join the discussions live on Facebook at St. Lucia, NCPC, the National Competitiveness and Productivity Council, embracing excellence.
Hello and welcome to this panel discussion by the National Integrated Planning and Program Unit, NIP, of the Infrastructure Resilience and the Disaster Risk Financing Strategy. How prepared is St. Lucia? I'm your moderator, Shannon Lamont, the Communications Officer within the Ministry of Infrastructure, Ports, Energy and Labour. My pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion. To begin the proceedings, we invite Ms. Kezia Sayers to invite the good Lord to bless this panel discussion. Warm welcome for Ms. Sayers, and we invite you all to stand.
Let's bow our heads. Lord, you are the purest definition of love. In the desire to make us share in this love, you sent your Son into the world to come to our aid. In his great love for all of us, Christ said that whatever we do for the least among us, we do for him. We give you thanks for calling us to be your people and for giving us your Son as our Lord and your Spirit to guide our lives. Bless us, bless all of us gathered here today. Open our hearts to the actions of your Holy Spirit. Touch and transform our hearts. Help us to realize our dependence on you. Make us aware of the great responsibility that you have entrusted in us. Help us to come to realistic decisions for the good of our nation. Father, may your spirit and wisdom guide us in moments of difficulty and lead us to make right judgments for the welfare of your people. We make this prayer through Christ, your Son, in love and unity for your Spirit, now, always, and forever. Amen.
Thank you, Kezia Sayers. Attendees, please be seated. We also say a warm welcome to individuals joining us online. Welcome once again to this panel discussion being held in commemoration of Productivity Awareness Month, Productivity Awareness Week, that is 2020. The new generation of infrastructure requires greater performance of infrastructure and infrastructure systems. This comes with increased vulnerability, and the future proofing of civil infrastructure projects is an enormous challenge facing small island developing states. Increases in economic growth has increased the demand for infrastructure, and corresponding increases in the supply of infrastructure alone is inadequate. Safe and resilient infrastructure is a lifeline for economies, and infrastructure systems, therefore, must be able to cope with complex and intense mix of hazards. Ladies and gentlemen, the catastrophic impact of disasters can be partly measured by loss of life and livelihoods, damage to public and private property, as well as the fiscal impacts arising from recovery and reconstruction expenditures and decreased tax revenue. Annual disaster losses account for a significant share of the gross domestic product, GDP. As such, the country's ability to manage the associated risk resulting from disasters is a major challenge and a development imperative. The infrastructure we rely on so heavily to sustain our economies are oftentimes not built for extreme weather events and natural disasters. The global cost of natural disasters continues to rise, and climate models predict increases in the frequency and the severity of natural disasters. If measures are not put in place in an integrated manner, we as a nation can expect the cost of human impact of disasters to rise. Cognizant of this stark reality facing us small island developing states, we ask the question, how resilient is our infrastructure? And what measures have we put in place to reduce the impact of disaster risks? To answer the question and to explore the associated elements of this discussion, our panelists include Mr. Chamberlain Emmanuel. Mr. Emmanuel is a sustainable development leader for over 20 years with practical experience across the region. As head of the Environmental Sustainable Division of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean State, OECS Commission, headquartered right here in St. Lucia, he has oversight for programs and projects spanning climate change and disaster resilience, biodiversity and ecosystems, land and water resources, ocean governance and fisheries, sustainable energy and chemicals, waste and pollution management. Chamberlain holds a BSc Honors of Civil Engineering from the University of West Indies, St. Augustine campus in Trinidad, a postgraduate diploma in Development and Project Planning, University of Bradford in the United Kingdom. Mr. Chamberlain Emmanuel, welcome to the panel. Joining us from Barbados via the Zoom platform, Ms. Sharon Griffith. Ms. Griffith is presently an Operations Officer, Civil Engineer in the Economic Infrastructure Division of Projects Department at the Caribbean Development Bank. She is responsible for the preparation, appraisal, and supervision of numerous technical assistance and capital works projects funded by the CDB throughout our region. She has also previously managed infrastructure projects at various stages of the project management cycle within the past 23 years. Ms. Sharon Griffith, if you can hear me, welcome. So glad for you to have joined us on the panel. Mr. Fabian Felix is presently a civil engineer within the National Integrated Planning and Program Unit, the NIP. He has served as a clerk of civil works and housing officer for the government of St. Lucia. Subsequent to this, he joined the private sector as a project manager, during which he managed many beachfront hotels and residential developments in St. Lucia. Fabian, a graduate of the Lincoln University in Missouri. He began his technical career at the Missouri Department of Transport as a highway materials inspector. Glad for you to have joined us on this panel this afternoon, Fabian Felix. Mr. Matthew Branford has been employed with the government of St. Lucia for the past 20 years. He has served in various capacities within the Ministry of Finance, namely accountant, field auditor, financial services regulator, financial analyst, assistant director, financial administration, deputy director of financial administration, and he's currently the acting accountant general. He possesses a bachelor's degree in accounting, a certified general accountant, and a certified public accountant. Rounding off our panelists this afternoon, Mr. Jamal Francis. He's an architect by profession, and he's been practicing architecture here in St. Lucia and the Caribbean for 15 years, but he has some 24 years experience in the construction industry. He started off as a lab technician with C.O. Williams, then moved up to assistant batcher before going to Cuba for study in the field of architecture. Since his return home, he has worked in a number of capacities, including assistant architecture on the Grosley and Marigot schools, architectural engineer at C.O. Williams Precast Limited, assistant architect, on the St. Lucia National Hospital, now the OKEU, and lead architect on many residential and commercial projects around our 238 square miles of St. Lucia. Welcome, Mr. Francis. Glad for you to have joined us. We'll begin the discussion with a presentation by each of the panelists who will speak for 5 minutes. And then we'll have some questions by me, the moderator. We'll open up for some questions from you, our specially invited guests as well. Protocol having been established, we now invite from the Caribbean Development Bank, Mrs. Sharon Griffith, to deliver her opening remarks.
Can you bear with me 1 minute, please? I'm trying to get this screen to come up.
And that we will be with you for the next 90 minutes.
I am having a bit of a technical difficulty. I'm trying to get the screen to come up, the PowerPoint. Is it possible for me to send it by email? Someone else can present while I send the email to someone, please.
Sure, we'll do that. So as we hold for Mrs. Griffith to sort out those technical issues, we invite now Mr. Chamberlain Emmanuel to make his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Shannon. Good afternoon to fellow panelists. Good afternoon to the audience here at the Financial Center and to all of you who are viewing us on television or online. It's a privilege to be able to be part of this important conversation and to make some remarks on behalf of the OECS Commission. The Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, as many or most of you would know, is an intergovernmental organization comprising right now 11 of the small island developed states in the Eastern Caribbean. We have 6 independent states, we have 3 non-independent British overseas territories, and now 2 of the French departments in Martinique and Guadeloupe. What really, or one of the things that clearly binds us together as a homogeneous group of islands, it's the whole issue of our vulnerability. Despite of the political status or the predominant language, all our member states are extremely vulnerable. And that vulnerability stems from various sources, whether it be our shared location. In fact, one of the quotes I love to refer to from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in their report number 5 is that climate may be one of the reasons why some countries are in poverty, and climate change, paraphrasing them, essentially would make it worse. So this is something that we share. Also, our sheer size, our systems, our lack of capacity, all lend to the whole issue of vulnerability. And so the question really for me, for us, is how do we convert or how do we mitigate this vulnerability to realize an acceptable level of resilience? And I'd like to propose that this really comes from strengthening our capacity. And capacities is quite broad, but capacity essentially empowers us to make the best decisions. And that is where we may not have billions of dollars, we may not have all the resources at our disposal, but if we were to be so empowered at the individual level, at the institutional level, at the family level, to make the best decisions with the limited resources that we have. I believe we would have great strides in terms of achieving some level of resilience. And this is where, in the context of looking at the resilience of our building stock, our infrastructure, the whole issue of the building code. And many times when you think of the building code, we imagine it is a matter of a big stick by an enforcement agency. But if we truly examine it as a tool to guide our decision making, then that essentially will be a great step towards resilience. Therefore, the OSS Commission has worked with our member states towards ensuring that we have equipped our various agencies and society broadly with updated tools so that those decisions in the way we build, in the way we spend our resources, in the way we locate our infrastructure, complies with certain standards. There's much more that could be said, but let me just say as I wrap up that there is also a tremendous benefit to doing things together in harmonizing. When we harmonize, it makes it easier for transfer of skills. When we harmonize, it makes it easier for us to share capacity and experience. And when we harmonize, it makes it more efficient to update and research so that we are always on the cutting edge. So just a plug for the Regional Integration Project, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Chamberlain Emmanuel, for those remarks, and of course we will dissect some of those issues which you brought up as we move along with the discussion. I'm told that Mrs. Sharon Griffith, we've sorted out the issues from Bridgetown, Barbados, and we can now have her opening remarks.
Again. Since the 1970s, the Caribbean Development Bank has been one of the region's most trusted development partners. The bank uses its influence, expertise, and resources to contribute to improvement of the lives of every citizen, with an emphasis on the most vulnerable. Before we get started, let's just look at what resilience really is. Now, resilience is the ability of a system, community, or society exposed to hazards to resist, absorb, accommodate to, and recover from the effects of a hazard in a timely and efficient manner. There are 4 key pillars which support resilience: economy, society, governance, and the environment. Now, between 1970 and 2020, CDB has managed to finance just over $6.3 billion in projects, 6.3 billion US dollars. And of this, within St. Lucia, we have funded some 553 million, which is $500 million. This is since 1970. So we've provided funding to support a range of projects and programs, mainly in the areas of infrastructure development and education. However, the past 5 years, net resource flows have been negative, in part due to implementation challenges and now the impact of COVID. Now, some quick projects that CDB has supported in the last 5 years, namely the rehabilitation of the John Compton Dam. These projects I'm going to show you are ongoing projects, and this is a total of 20 million US dollars. We have the Millennium Highway and West Coast Road, which should get started. You should see some physical work early in 2021. And as recent as September, the CDB provided a policy-based loan to support your COVID-19 recovery response, and this was in the sum of $30 million. Now, CDB fully understands and appreciates the needs and the aspirations of our board member countries, especially that of becoming to have developed country status. But some countries are more ahead than some. But in us seeking to support our countries to become developed country status, we have subscribed and we focus, as you do, on the Sustainable Development Goals. However, we realize that there are some challenges facing us and our BMCs. That is the gross domestic product falling behind in some of the small island developing states. And the moderator would have alluded to this at the beginning. Pockets of poverty alongside inequality, vulnerability to natural hazards, high cost of doing business, infrastructure deficits, weak implementation capacity, fiscal and debt sustainability issues, and dependence on fossil fuels, an uncertain global environment such as what's happening right now with COVID-19. So the question could be asked, what is CDB doing to meet this challenge? How is CDB responding? In December 2019, CDB revised and the board approved its strategy for 2020 to 2024. We have also revised our mission statement, which is now to reduce poverty and transforming lives through sustainable, resilient, and inclusive development. You can see our goals here, and they're very much in alignment with our board member countries. We go from having a holistic, integrated, a more holistic and integrated approach to development, closing infrastructure gaps. We're going to expand our private sector role. We are in the process of transforming CDB and balancing country demand with the bank's resource availability. Now, our strategic objectives are very much in alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals, and they're all hinged on the pillars of resilience. So we are looking at between 2020 and 2024 in supporting you, our board member countries, through building social resilience, building economic resilience, and building environmental resilience. And you can also see here the areas of focus. I'm not going to go through those. But we also have, along with our 2020 to 2024 strategy, we have a whole slew of policy and strategies which also support resilient infrastructure. From our disaster management strategy and operational guidelines, which is presently being revised. We have a climate resilience strategy, energy sector policy. Sorry, those are supposed to be two different strategies. We also have a housing sector policy and strategy, and a transport policy and strategy, and our urban sector policy and strategy. As you can clearly see, CDB's new strategy is very much in alignment with the St. Lucia's strategies for the midterm development, for your medium-term development. And I've demonstrated this in this slide. Now, how are we seeking to continue to support you? For this year alone, we have sought to reduce the interest rate on our ordinary capital resources. From January, it was 4.50, and from this month, October, we have reduced it to 3.75. This is for the public sector. For financial intermediaries, we will have a same reduction, but for the private sector loans, it will be reduced from 6.5 to 5.75. We also have under our loan portfolio, special fund resources, which are approximately 1%, and then we have other special funds as well. CDB continues to support our board member countries with partnerships with many multilaterals. And we have like the Millennium Highway, which is being funded by the United Kingdom Caribbean Infrastructure Fund. This is a grant of close to $30 million. And we also have the European Investment Bank, which through the second action line of credit provides grant funding as well. And we have grant funding from the French bank. So in between 2015 and 2019, our grant funds came to approximately $552 million. And as I said before, St. Lucia has benefited greatly from this as well. So we also have grant funding and concessionary funding is not only grant, but concessionary funding under the energy sector, climate change, and capacity building. So the Caribbean Development Bank continues to support the board member countries, and namely St. Lucia, in building a high level of resilience in their infrastructure. And we continue to stress the need for forward planning and also for evidence-based infrastructure. And for this, I thank you and look forward to the questions during the discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Griffith. And we note the substantial investment of our institution, the Caribbean Development Bank, in the tune of some $6.3 billion, I think you stated, over the last 10 years of investment in your borrowing member countries. We'd like to explore your recommendations and your advice as we move the discussion along on some of the challenges that the borrowing member states face, especially in the area of implementation. I think you said for us here in St. Lucia that has been a challenge over the last few years. So as we move on, we look forward to your advice and recommendations. We now take in the opening statement by Mr. Matthew Branford, the Acting Accountant General here in St. Lucia.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Moderator, Mr. Labon. Good evening, everyone in the audience and those listening online on television. Disasters has been a threat to our economy for a very, very long time. It spanned a number of decades. In all of those occasions, the Ministry of Finance has to come up with various financing option techniques, utilize various products to combat disasters. Of most, we've seen our GDP growth in the country being affected heavily by disasters. And on many occasions, we have to go back to the drawing board and to recalibrate our projections. So disasters on a whole has been affecting our GDP. It has threatened the debt sustainability of the economy, because many times you would have disasters, you would have to seek borrowing, access your borrowings from the market, restructure your debt as much as possible to combat the disasters. This has also affected economic activity and threatened the livelihoods of many persons in the economy. We'll recall that Hurricane Arlene in 1980 had caused tremendous damage to the economy, about 305% of GDP in that time. We experienced Tropical Storm Debby in 1994. We had Hurricane Dean. We had the Christmas Eve trough. We had Hurricane Matthew. We had Hurricane Maria. And we are actually experiencing a different type of disaster right now in the COVID-19. All of which has tremendous impact on the country's finances. And going through the COVID-19 situation now has stretched all economies around the OECS, around the globe, and is impacting countries globally. So there is a challenge. Nevertheless, St. Lucia has learned a lot from those disasters and has put many measures in place. And as we go through this evening, I will go through our disaster risk financing strategy to indicate how we have put measures to mitigate the impact, because we cannot really get rid of disasters on a whole. We can only manage it and mitigate it. So the Ministry of Finance with various departments are actually working very hard to manage many of our disaster threats. We are still doing a lot of resilience measures in terms of capital projects, and I'm happy I'm sharing the podium with a number of architects and engineers. And I'm sure many of them can understand why we are in this situation now. And some of those structures which some of my colleagues may have been involved in the design and the construction, and now probably witnessing that the type of disasters that we are faced with, they are even more intense and they are even stronger, causing greater impact on the economy. So the Ministry of Finance is committed into implementing measures to combat many of those disasters that we face going forward. Thank you.
Mr. Matthew Branford, he is the Acting Accountant General here in St. Lucia. We note, sir, the steps towards the development of a disaster risk financing strategy. As you promised, we'll get some more information on that as we proceed. I also look forward, if you are able to, if you provide us with some specifics in terms of some numbers so we can better appreciate the impact of those events on our fiscal situation here in St. Lucia. We now turn our attention over to Mr. Fabian Felix from the NIP, who will present on the integrated infrastructure planning.
Pleasant good afternoon to everybody. So I'll start off by making a statement, a bold statement, and that is most, if not all, of government's policies are executed through some form of infrastructure project. And I'll just let that sink in. Infrastructure traditionally refers to any system that improves the quality of life of a people, a country, a city, you name it. The new thinking of infrastructure is that it must include the people, the human resources, the mindset, the knowledge base, the institutions that work or are exposed to those systems. And that's a new thinking that we, within the NIP, we're trying to adopt, and we're trying to send a message across to all our colleagues in the built environment sector. Failures of these systems can be detrimental to any economy. For that reason, it must be very important for any government, including ours, to look at infrastructure systems differently and look at the long term. For this, the NIP, we've established our evidence-based infrastructure framework, where we look at infrastructure systems and we look at long-term planning of infrastructure based on the available data. It's a challenge with data sets in small island states like St. Lucia, but we are able to come up with certain metrics and certain recommendations coming out of our study that we recently completed on where we should be as a country with regards to infrastructure. Infrastructure, unlike Ms. Griffith said from CDB, it spans three major sectors: the economic sector, the social sector, and the environmental sector. What we found is that infrastructure systems, they pretty much span over 92% of the Sustainable Development Goals, which I guess we'll elaborate on in a little while. So infrastructure systems are very important for our social well-being, for our environmental well-being, and for the economic sector as well. So that's why the government of St. Lucia and through the Department of Finance, they found it necessary to have systems in place to look at the overall picture of infrastructure in St. Lucia. That's where the integrated part comes in. So we look at infrastructure systems as not silo items or components. The systems are connected. They are interdependent on each other. For example, you build a hospital. That hospital doesn't operate on its own. It requires energy, it requires telecommunication, it requires water, it requires a transportation network. So those systems are looked at in a combined effort. They are not looked at in a silo manner. And that's one thing we're doing within the NIP, to look at systems of infrastructure and not just individual assets. In looking at it that way, better decisions could be made as to where to build things, how to build things, when to build things, and when not to build things. Because as you know, the financial situation through the COVID pandemic is not ideal for a lot of nations, including developed, richer countries. So infrastructure systems, because of how critical they are to be looked at in a different manner, looking forward to the near future. And with that, I end my short speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fabian Felix, and we appreciate the evidence-based approach being undertaken by your team at the NIP. We explore that a lot more as we move forward. The last opening presentation, by no means least, brings to the panel over 20 years of experience working in construction across the region. We now invite Mr. Jamal Francis to give his opening remarks.
Yes, good day. As Mr. Moderator mentioned, I am a registered architect, but I'm also here in my capacity today as president of the Institute of Architects of St. Lucia. I'm also a lead green associate. So a lot of what I will be saying here today is in my capacity as an architect and as I said, a lead green associate. So a lot of my focus will not only be on infrastructural projects, but on residential projects, on commercial projects, on general land use on the whole. The Institute of Architects has always tried to find ways to get the government and the legislative arm, I suppose, to pass legislation to strengthen the possibilities for construction of residential units in St. Lucia. I always recall after Hurricane Maria, I got some statistics that stated that in Caribbean states, about 80% of our building stock is residential. Right? That is very telling. That says that the majority of the buildings in our islands are small residential units. That says that we need to spend a lot more time and effort on the homeowners. Because after Maria passed through Dominica, for example, the homeowners were the ones who were mostly affected. Yes, the roads and the bridges were destroyed. Those would be taken care of by governments. But what happened is you found a lot of smaller folks trying to rebuild their homes with whatever they could find, with no supervision, with no technical assistance. And basically what it is that they're setting themselves up to fail again because things weren't put in place to help these people to rebuild better than they had before. So I think in St. Lucia, the Architects Registration Act was a step in the right direction, but I think that there's a lot more legislation that needs to be passed in order to help our country build more resiliently. St. Lucia has been lucky, honestly. It is okay for us to beat our chest, but we haven't had a serious hurricane since Hurricane Allen. Hurricane Thomas was our last real hurricane, and that was a little over Category 1, I believe. And you could see the amount of damage that caused in St. Lucia. So we haven't been put to the test in a while. And I'm just hoping that when we are put to the test, we aren't found wanting. So, as I was saying, SLIA on the whole at the Institute of Architects plans to do a lot of public sensitization and education because we believe that having a more demanding clientele, having a public who asks more of their design professionals and of their government in terms of incentives, in terms of legislation, is the way forward. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamal Francis. A round of applause for the panelists on their opening presentations. As we proceed, Mr. Francis, we will be questioning your experience on what needs to be done to build more resilient infrastructure, not just in St. Lucia, but across the region. We now move into the question and answer segment. We have also put together a grouping of experts, an audience with some experts, and we will be entertaining questions from the audience as we proceed. If you want to interject and ask a question, just identify yourself. We have a roving microphone. When you are signaled, we ask that you introduce yourself and ask your question. We begin discussion again with Mr. Chamberlain Emmanuel from the OECS Commission. I would like to find out what are some of the measures which are currently being undertaken by the OECS region to improve their systems and to put in place relevant structures to reduce the vulnerability of states and to build resilient societies. I can repeat the question. What are some of the measures which are currently being implemented by the OECS region to improve their systems and put in place relevant structures to reduce the vulnerability of states and to build resilient societies.
Thank you very much, and also appreciated very much the opening statements from my colleagues. As I hinted to, one of the things we are doing together is ensure that certain tools are in place, harmonized tools, to ensure we have the capacity in the net to make the right decisions. There is obviously a distinction between an institution like the OECS and a sovereign government who would undertake, more intense infrastructure injection. What OECS seeks to do is to bring our institutions together so that we can do more collectively. So one of the gains, as I've indicated, is recently ending in 2019. We would have engaged in a process with some funding from one of our partners in updating the OECS building codes. And the process actually started a little before the 2017 hurricanes, Maria and Irma, that swept through the region, and really showed how timely and how relevant such an initiative is. So we have ended up with the assistance of experts from the region, including colleagues who know Tony Gibbs and other colleagues right here from St. Lucia, would have updated the code based on recent research and analysis that would have been done, whether it be for wind speeds, for temperature, bringing in considerations for differently abled, etc. So all of these have been updated. In addition to the core code, which is used by designers, we have also updated the building guidelines, which are more simplified with illustrations and photos, etc., including an annex showing some of the lessons from the 2017 hurricane, that we can see some of the failure modes, etc., in there. And also to help assist our member states in implementing the code, would have updated the administrative provisions, looking at individually each member state, the legislation, the regulations that are in place, the institutions that are to administer the code, what are the adjustments that are to be made. So all of these are ready. What is missing in terms of the actual enactment, etc., is that little piece we know always with doing the legislative language and taking it through the various acts of parliament, etc. So that is where we are at. The code remains a reference, I know, for our DCA, etc., even though it's not officially enacted, but it remains a reference. But we need to move to the next level to actually, make it law. Just want to indicate also, we would have also recently done a piece of work for guidelines for resilient schools. We know that schools are so much at the center of society, and resilient schools, not just in terms of being able to withstand hurricane wind, but as my colleague from the Architects Association, Mr. Fabian Felix actually said, resilient infrastructure is about systems. So it's not just about the roof, but where are we located? What is the condition of the road that takes you to the school? So the school might stand up, but is the road passable? So all of these considerations are now in this document and are available for access and for use.
But from the OECS, the message remains, because of our small size and our vulnerability, there is tremendous value in reducing our vulnerability if we work together.
Absolutely. Matthew mentioned the numbers for St. Lucia, but this story goes throughout the OECS, whether it be Ivan in Grenada, Irma and Maria in the BVI, and Dominica, Thomas for us. We are in what we refer to as cyclical retardation. We are hit, we try to use the money we don't have to recover, then we are hit again while we are recovering. So it's like spinning top in mud. and we need to ensure we do what we can to ensure that we reduce that cycle that is keeping us in that poverty.
Thank you, Mr. Emmanuel. And I know perhaps from the desk of the Caribbean Development Bank, Mrs. Griffith, satisfaction that the countries in the OECS have moved to review the building codes and the associated elements of the building codes and the you said the building guidelines as well. Good move in the right direction.
Very much so. We continue to support the OECS. We are presently providing funding to revise the building code within the region as well. Now, I know you haven't asked me a question yet, but if you, just to say how CDB also continues to support the region in terms of building resilience, we've always seen this as important. You know that it may have changed from from environment to climate, now to resilience. But CDB has always been a champion for the region in terms of supporting the bar member countries in building resilience. And presently, as I showed in the presentation, we have a slew of policies and strategies to do so. In our design of our projects as well, and I'm going to make reference specifically to the Millennium Highway, because this is your most recent project, we ensured that climate vulnerability assessments, environmental impact assessments, these were done to ensure that the designs and the sustainability of the project would actually be there. And this is something that is cross-cutting for all of our infrastructure projects in the region. All projects now have to have, from the inception, have to have climate risk screening. And then on assessing their feasibility, we can move forward. And during the feasibility, we can have the climate vulnerability assessment. All of these allow for the project to have a high level of sustainability. And we have a series of toolkits as well to support our bar member countries. We have toolkits in terms of climate for the water and sanitation sector and the transport sector. So the CDB continues to support the region in terms of building resilience from its technical assistance portfolio.
I think the panelists would agree that the evidence is there that the CDB definitely remains committed to supporting and being a champion for its member states in building resilience. Move over to the acting accountant general. What measures have been put in place by the government to reduce its exposure to natural disasters?
Yeah. Very good question, Mr. Labon, because the Caribbean being in the disaster zone, every time there is the hurricane belt, not only St. Lucia gets affected, but all the countries within that line also gets affected. So some of the measures that St. Lucia has put in place is that, number one, we have identified a number of our weak points with regards to how we respond to disasters. And the first process started with developing a disaster risk financing strategy, because without a formulated plan and strategy, you cannot really combat disasters effectively. So St. Lucia has approved a disaster risk financing strategy, and that is also supported by the Cabinet of Ministers. Other options that St. Lucia has put in place is that we are a participating country with the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility. So St. Lucia has actually participated from the time the CRIF started, I think as early as 2007, participated in purchasing insurance to be able to manage and transfer its risks of disasters. So we have had those insurance in place every year, We ensure that those resources from the budgets are allocated on a yearly basis to be able to secure those coverage. Recently, we have extended over the last 2 years, coverage has gone to persons in the fishery sector, which is called a coast policy that covers persons in the fishery sector. We've also developed in other risk financing mechanism in terms of certain line of credit to be able to access various lines of credit in case that we are faced with a disaster. So these are some of the measures that we have put in place, and they have worked very well because we have been receiving payouts from CRIF every time that our policy is being triggered. Every now and then. We hope that that disasters do not strike us. It's not fun having to, just because you have a policy and so you're receiving a payout, and those payouts normally are not to cover the 100% of what the effects that you experience with a disaster. So while we have those measures in place, these are all risk financing measures, but our hope is that we don't get to utilize this because it's always something bad when you have to get payouts from insurance.
Perhaps unintentionally you preempted my question on the role of the insurers, but to discuss a bit the disaster risk financing strategy. Mr. Branford, what are some of the key features of the strategy, and how do we intend to evaluate the performance of that strategy?
Okay, so basically, disaster risk financing strategy is to aim to reduce the economic and fiscal impact caused by a disaster, based on the concept of cost effectiveness. Disasters are always going to be costly. There's always going to be financial resources being laid out for a disaster. Disaster financing risk strategy also involves developing instruments for the retention and the transfer of risks. So these are some of the key what disaster financing strategy really means. St. Lucia disaster financing risk strategy main objective is to strengthen the government of St. Lucia ability to assess. We need to assess risk is an important criteria to be able to manage. So you must be able to assess risk before you can manage the risk. Also, it intends to reduce and manage fiscal risk due to a disaster. As I said earlier on, that disasters have a significant impact on our GDP. So to be able to reduce and manage those fiscal risks is an important criteria. The main priorities of our disaster risk financing strategy is to build resilience. And that involves not just the Ministry of Finance, but that will involve other components, other stakeholders, like some of the architects and engineers who are here now, who will build more resilient infrastructure. So that is also part of our disaster risk financing strategy. We also intend to develop cost-effective and accessible financing mechanism for immediate liquidity that can be channeled rapidly to prioritize institutions and sectors. As when a disaster hits a country, St. Lucia not being no exception, one of the main thing is access to finance. And so with those key elements in place, we're able to access finance within quick time, because most persons, the number of sectors that would have been affected would be calling on the government to assist. So that are some of the part of the strategy. The strategic priority area focus of the strategy also involves data collection and management. Without effective data management and collection, your history is not clear. You do not know how to prioritize, you do not know how to plan for the future. So data collection is a key criteria in terms of our priority. Also, strengthening our public financial management system. Disasters will always, you get donations from, like Ms. Griffith said, CDP provide grants. And so our PFM system need to show that our management of those funds are transparent and in accordance to the accepted procedure of the country. So that would involve strengthening our public financial management laws, our procurement laws, and even during the COVID-19, part of our emergency procedure was to involve our procurement process in terms of purchasing supplies and so on for the COVID-19 response. Also improving fiscal protection and timely access to financing and risk retention and risk transfer instrument. These are some of the key priority areas of the strategy. And increased collaboration with the private sector. The private sector is also a partner in our disaster risk financing strategy. You need institution, the supermarkets, you need WASCO, you need Lucilec, you need the telecommunication sector to also be part and to rebuild the country as quickly as possible and to get the country's operation running. It's very important for the Ministry of Finance to restart the economy as quickly as possible after disaster, because every day that the country remains shut down, its impact on our GDP growth and our capacity to maintain our other obligations like our debt. So these are key priority areas of our strategy, and it's in this strategy, the disaster risk financing strategy. Most of the key elements should be fully implemented by the year 2021.
Thank you for that. Ms. Griffith, I'd be pleased if we can zoom in just for a minute or two on a point raised here by Mr. Branford. The need by borrowing member states to timely access financing, particularly in the immediate aftermath of disasters, without compromising the process. We know there's a need for the ESIAs and the various assessments to be done. What's the position of the bank in as far as a faster drawdown of resources to your borrowing member countries, particularly in the immediate aftermath of disasters?
Well, presently the bank has a disaster management strategy, and that's a 2009 strategy, and that supports our immediate response. The strategy, as I said, is being revised, but under the old strategy, presently we have the immediate response grant, where countries have access to $200,000. And then we have the immediate response loan, and that is with up to $750,000. And these are released within hours to a few days following a disaster. Now, the reconstruction and rehabilitation loan, which you have also benefited from, that normally has to go through an appraisal process, but sometimes the projects that are identified that would require immediate assistance do not necessarily have to have a feasibility study completed. We would mobilize the funds, and these funds can range from 1 million up to 30, 50 million. It depends on the need for the full reconstruction efforts. But the bank, having seen the need to increase the immediate response loan, that is going to be, as I said, that is $750,000, and that is going to be increased significantly from $750,000. So normally that is facilitated by the government sending a letter, first declaring a state of emergency, and then sending a letter via its Ministry of Finance to the CDB indicating that they require immediate assistance in the form of a loan. And as I said, the $750,000 we realize has not necessarily covered all of the needs and the requirements of countries in that short period of time. So the immediate response grant covers cleanups or whatever, just the immediate stuff. The emergency stuff. And then the immediate response grant, immediate response loan, we want to extend that even further beyond just cleaning up and those sort of initial things. We want to extend it fully into the country being able to rehabilitate and get the country back to as normal a state in the shortest possible time, whereas the reconstruction rehabilitation loan will be for the medium to long term. So we are revisiting that particular strategy, and we're hoping to have it approved before the end of the year or early next year. And this would allow our countries within the new hurricane season to have a quicker level of access. But even now, under the old strategy, you still have the ability to access those funds quickly. And we know that the government of St. Lucia has benefited from this. But one of the hindrances we have also noted from even having quick access to certain types of funds, sometimes these projects take a very long time to execute. So internal country capacity as well to absorb the funds and to get the country back to a level of normalcy is another issue. And we've also added psychosocial support. And that is something that we found was absolutely necessary. And this came out of the hurricane season 2017. And we provided, that was a new level of support that we provided to Antigua and Barbuda, and we found, and Dominica, and we found that these were very, very critical as well. So the bank hears you, the bank is adjusting, and we are looking to upgrade that particular strategy to ensure that you have a quicker access to funds.
Much appreciated, Mrs. Griffith, on what you're doing to review your DRFS. I know a number of finance ministers around the Caribbean would have been listening with key focus on maybe an announcement from you on the immediate response loan, the increase from 750,000 to what? But I guess we wait for the official correspondence coming out from your desk when that package is confirmed. Another important tool for us here in St. Lucia, apart from our disaster-rich financing strategy, is the National Infrastructure Assessment Report, which was recently launched. Mr. Felix, what does the document speak to, and how does it speak to infrastructure resilience?
So the National Infrastructure Assessment Report, what it does, it estimates St. Lucia's infrastructure needs from the short term to the long term. So it makes recommendations as to what to build, when to build, or where to build it. It comprises two components. There's a long-term planning component that looks at several sectors and several infrastructure sectors in St. Lucia. So it looks at wastewater, water, solid waste, what else? Transportation to some extent. And what it does, it estimates what our infrastructure needs based on two demand scenarios, or two demand drivers, which are population rise and, of course, the tourism arrival figures. These are the two stressors on our infrastructure assets. So if population increases, there'll be a greater demand on water, electricity, wastewater, solid waste. So the assessment, what it does, it looks at population changes. It looks at from now till 2050 and what will be our infrastructure needs. That's the first component of the report. The second one is an adaptation planning component. So it really aligns our major infrastructural asset and looks at the geospatial scenario that exists in St. Lucia, where our critical assets are located and what are they exposed to in terms of hazards. So the report looks at 4 hazard scenarios, 1 meter sea level rise, that's associated with a 4-meter storm surge scenario. It also looks at landslides and inland flooding. So it looks at the map of St. Lucia and where those assets are located and how much is the exposure. A critical component of the National Infrastructure Assessment Report as well is to look at how our attempts at building infrastructure and how they align with the SDGs. And I made mention earlier that infrastructure, it covers 92% of all the targets. Whether it be we're looking at zero hunger, you need some form of infrastructure to combat that. Whether it be a school with some school feeding program, when you look at life below water, the way we design our wastewater systems, how it doesn't affect the marine environment, that's an infrastructure component. So infrastructure really covers all 92% of the 17 SDG targets. But that's the whole, in short, that's what the report is all about. It will be available online shortly. It's a public document, and we're hoping that the impact of that document will be able to inform better decision making within the infrastructure sector or the built environment.
What about financing? Does the report speak to financing of infrastructure?
Not quite. What it does speak to is how we should perform as a country. So we looked at two scenarios. A do-nothing approach based on our population and tourism projection, meaning we just leave it as is, we don't react to population changes. We looked at the business as usual approach, which is the current way we are operating, silo-based, different ministries are doing different projects, they're not talking to each other. And then we look at a national infrastructure strategy, which is a hybrid, looking at the population changes, the demand drivers, and what we should build. That speaks to financing, how we should finance infrastructure, or how much we can save as a country in building infrastructure assets. So for example, what we looked at is that it's actually cheaper to invest in the right infrastructure now, because in the long term it will cost less if you build the right infrastructure right now than to be waiting for that time to come to react to those demand drivers. So it looks at that type of strategy, but not directly financing infrastructure. We are currently working with our researchers and development partners to work on an infrastructure financing tool, a sustainable infrastructure financing tool. As you may be aware of, different donor agencies have different requirements. Some would fund high capital projects, some will only fund research projects, some may fund water projects, some may not fund water projects. So that tool will help us guide which donors to approach. So it will cut back on how much the discussions we have, the day-to-day meetings. So it will actually recommend which donors to go to for what type of infrastructure project. So we are working on that tool, and we're hoping to launch it early 2021.
We look forward to that. Mr. Francis, you've worked and operated with you for a number of years as a professional architect. Your views was to begin on the steps being made by the NIP with a National Infrastructure Assessment Report and what finance is doing with the disaster risk financing strategy.
Okay, so I think that generally the approach being taken is it's working to an extent. I think that a lot of the issues we may be having might be, I suppose, at an institutional level, where you find that sometimes the correct professionals are not involved from the get-go in certain projects. So where you may only have, you know, engineers and surveyors on a project, you may need an architect at a more elevated role in that project, that sort of thing. I think that generally they have done a good job of looking at the financing of it. I don't believe that in terms of architecture there's too much to be spoken about in reference to the infrastructure in the country.
But a move in the right direction, you think that they're starting to invest resources and time to get these?
I think they are investing resources and time, yes. But again, I think it's just that sometimes you need a few more professionals having their voices heard in certain projects and how certain projects are executed.
Appreciate it. And in your opening remarks, Mr. Francis, you did speak to the plan from your association to engage in a lot of public education. Mm-hmm. I'd like to ask you, what level of understanding and appreciation and application or lack thereof of how important is climate change consciousness amongst your peers and within your profession?
I think the consciousness in my profession and related professions, engineers, surveyors, quantity surveyors, I think it's very high. I think we have a good appreciation for what is necessary. I think we try to encourage clients, governments, etc., to design the right way and to design as sustainably as possible. But again, as I said, I think that the main issue is at the client end. So an architect or an engineer can design the most sustainable building there is. But if in the end, when it comes down to construction, you start to value engineer certain things out, then you lose a lot of the gains that could have been made. Water resources, for example, is one key area. You may design rainwater collection and rainwater reuse in a building. When it comes down to construction, there's no telling what is actually going to be done. A lot of the time, they just decide that it's too much trouble or too much cost to implement what you have proposed, and they value engineer that out. The project never, something as simple, for example, as using rainwater to flush toilets, to do certain things in the building. These are things that we really should be putting into all our major, as both infrastructure buildings, hotels as well should do it. But hospitals, schools, etc., should all be doing these things. It's not being done because it's never carried through, And a lot of the time, as I said, it is on the client's end, and it gets value engineered out with the contractors as well.
If we improve and raise the consciousness from your clients, from consumers, are you confident that will result in a increased investment in resilience? I
believe so. I believe, and as I said, you also need to give them some sort of, what I'm looking for, incentives, because you have, as long as your client is requesting a green building, if your client comes to you and they tells you that they want a green building, they want to ensure that their power levels are, their power cost is below a certain threshold, and you will design that for them. Now, let me walk myself back a bit and say that when professionals are involved, you generally get those designs done. Another problem we have here in St. Lucia and in a lot of the Caribbean islands, I know, is that a lot of our buildings, not just residential, commercial as well, are not designed by professionals. So you have a lot of buildings being designed by persons who are not trained to do these designs. And when you have that happening, now you also, of course, will lose out on a lot of the gains that can be made. In the Cross-Q conference, I think it was last week or week before, on energy efficiency, they mentioned, there was a study out of Antigua, I think it was, that mentioned, I think 40, hold on, I made a note of it. Yes, 45% of commercial buildings, of fossil fuel use comes from commercial buildings, and 38% comes from residential. So together, that if you can reduce these two, the energy used, the resources used in commercial and residential buildings, you have some serious savings you can look at across the board in the islands.
Thanks for that. And of concern to us would be the point that you would have just ended there, the issue of energy efficiency. I hope to explore that as we proceed. But for any of our panelists, feel free to interject. If you want to come in on something that a fellow panelist would have said or to add to the discussion, please feel free. Chamberlain, you signaling.
Yeah, thanks. Just want to add a little to what has been said. I think just as that has been said in terms of ensuring that physical infrastructure is integrated, whether it be the building of the road, etc. If we look at the proposed implementation plan for the building code, just as an example, what it speaks to is ensuring that there is integration among institutions and sectors. So yes, for example, you may have a code, you may have it in law, but how are we partnering with the financial institutions, with the insurance companies, with the providers of the commercial businesses, to ensure that we are working hand in hand and there is a system of incentives, etc., to encourage homeowners to adopt the recommendations for better resilience. So if I have a budget of $300,000 to build a home, and the professionals have recommended rainwater harvesting, have recommended screws instead of nails, have recommended certain standards of material, and that takes me to $315,000, my instinct is to cut, right? But if when I go to my credit union or the bank and the insurance, they tell me, well, if you go with these things, I will reduce your payment, your interest by 1% or 0.5%. And when I go to get the approval, I get a certificate from DCA that goes to Inland Revenue to reduce my income tax. That is incentive, right? But except all of us work together, then we always have a way out to do what is cheapest. But keep in mind, as Engineer Gibbs normally says, the cheapest building is not the one where you put in all the recommendations for the standard. The cheapest building is the one that does not collapse. All right, because when the storm comes and when you cannot withstand the hazard, that's when you know how expensive not abiding by the standard is. So we really need to pull together, right? It cannot just be by enforcement. Or everyone has to, all of society, all institutions, government, financial institutions, the designers, etc. Let's pull together and find a solution that we all can contribute to ensure that we are incentivizing people to do the right thing.
We get some input here from Mr. Felix, and then I want to bring in Mrs. Griffith on this discussion.
Just to add to the discussion and just adding to what Architect Francis said here, on the national level and the integrated level, we look at our resources as scarce. And like he made the argument that, using rainwater harvesting, for example, or rainwater reuse, we have a water situation in St. Lucia where we consume approximately 40,000 cubic meters a day. And WASCO can only supply, no, the other way around. We consume 60,000 cubic meters per day, and WASCO can only supply 40,000 cubic meters per day. So there's a gross undercapacity within our water sector. So with an architect making a recommendation to, reuse rainwater for domestic purposes, it's very important that we allow the professionals to play their part in the whole built environment. And as you can see, from the domestic level to the national level, there is a huge connection. And at the end of the day, we as a country will suffer if those recommendations are not adhered or they're not implemented.
Ms. Griffith, just before Mr. Francis comes back on, you've heard what has been said over the last 2 minutes. How can the bank perhaps incentivize its borrowing member states to look at what might be termed the low-hanging fruit investments in rainwater harvesting, energy efficiency, that sort of thing?
We presently, as well, I said before, we presently provide technical assistance in terms of grants and loans, but we also have conferences and forums where we would try to bring all the stakeholders together to hear all the voices from the architects and the engineers, but all stakeholders, so that we could fully understand everyone's point of view in terms of developing the infrastructure. Now, in terms of achieving, being able to deal with the low-hanging fruit, this is done, as I said, through technical assistance, but is also integrated in project design as well. For instance, from a community level, if you have like feeder roads to be done, we would not only look at doing the actual feeder roads, but we would look at other opportunities to support the farmers in the area as well, to strengthen their economic capacity. So it's not a myopic view in only looking at the infrastructure itself, but also the people capital to support the infrastructure. So it's a holistic approach that we try to do even with our infrastructure projects. So without the people, you will not have the sustainability of the infrastructure. So holistic approach is done, and our projects are designed in this holistic manner. So sometimes countries would want to know why we have to have in this particular component, that component. That is to ensure the sustainability of the project.
Thank you.
All right, yeah, I'll be quick. I wanted to make the point after they had spoken that I honestly believe that our largest consumers of water should be mandated to harvest rainwater. I honestly, as he said, we don't supply enough for our demand. And that has a lot to do, I mean, we depend a lot on tourism. We have a lot of hotels down here that consume a lot of water. I believe that they should be mandated to harvest a large percentage of their water usage. In terms of incentives, I just wanted to mention, I think banks and insurance companies should actually play a larger role in engaging architects on projects. It's in their interest. A bank owns a building until it's paid off. So it's their building. If the building is destroyed in a hurricane, then it's their building that's being lost. An insurance company is the same thing. They're insuring the building. If the building is designed properly and built properly, supervised while it's being built, then you are going to, it is going to augur well for you, because you will have less money to pay off, out to your clients. And I think that one of the easiest incentives is for insurance companies to give better rates to houses that are designed hurricane resistant. There's an ad out of Barbados from one of the insurance companies where the guy's wife is telling him that she noticed that he quoted the house at only half the actual value, and he's saying it's for him to save on the premiums. That is a serious incentive. If you tell people, listen, by putting in hurricane-resistant windows, by implementing all of the requirements, to make your house more hurricane resilient, you are going to pay less on your premiums for your insurance. They will listen. These are the sort of incentives I believe we should be pushing.
As we wind down on, sure.
Standpoint would be concessionary funding, especially projects that would look at energy efficiency and also climate resilience. So the type of funding that we would get from the European Investment Bank and our partners, those always come with these, that come under a concessionary manner, are attached to projects which can demonstrate that they can reach that level of resilience. So the things that you're speaking about, like rainwater harvesting and certain design concepts to build resilience, the only way that these things can become successful, only way these projects can become successful and attracting necessary funding is to make sure that there are within the design as well.
Thank you. And as we wind down on time, again, to the members of the audience, if you have a question, just signal and we will refer to you. I want to zoom in on a few issues raised in the introductory remarks. The role of insurers. Mr. Branford, what role does these insurance companies, or do these insurance companies play in responding to disasters?
Yeah, thank you again, Mr. Labon. Insurance have been in the market for a very long time, and insurance primary role is to the transfer of risk. Taking the risk away from the primary risk holder and to transferring it to the insurance companies. The insurance companies over the market, over time, have provided many different insurance, liability insurance, you have property insurance, and we were speaking about having to probably get a reduction in the rate because probably you have more hurricane resistance building. Never mind, these measures can reduce your rate to probably a certain extent, but at the end of the day, you are actually insuring your house for the value, and there is going to be a cost to that, and it all depends on the price of reinsurance in the market. So there are several other factors, because you may be hurricane resistant, but you may not be earthquake resistant. And all these various perils are real perils that can affect your property. And certain persons' insurance may be more expensive, probably because of the hazards around their property or where they are located. So they can experience different risks. But however, I agree that certain of those factors can improve. We have in the market, there is not much of the insurance that is offered by the CRIF, which is parametric insurance or micro insurance. These insurance directly impact you when there is a disaster. So St. Lucia has, there was this livelihood protection plan that's been offered by the CRIF, and a lot of persons benefited because their policy was triggered probably because of a tropical cyclone level. And so those insurance provide very good coverage level for persons who are affected. It's important that the insurance market be innovative and be more proactive, and to offer the products that will really impact persons' life after there is a disaster. We find that the insurance industry is not so innovative in that area. However, the CRIF has offered many products that can be purchased both by sovereign state as well as for persons who are affected. The CRIF has also launched a new product, utilities, for the utility sector. And so disasters, when you have electrical poles being down and so on, those policies are going to help the utility sector get back on their foot as quickly as possible. So insurance on the whole provide, it's one of the effective mechanism for dealing with risks, all types of risks. And I think they have helped in the market before, but there can be more innovation in the market going forward.
Absolutely. Ms. Providence, Mr. Wells, perhaps missing element on today's panel, representative from the insurance sector. Mrs. Griffith, in your introductory remarks, you made the point that our borrowing member countries face a challenge with the implementation of a number of projects. And I want to go back to 2015. The month was September, when former Prime Minister David Cameron was in Kingston, Jamaica, and he made available to the countries of the Caribbean a grant of some $500 million. 5 years on, St. Lucia, our portion of $30 million towards the Millennium Highway and West Coast Road. Good news this afternoon from you that we should expect work on the ground in early 2021. That example of the UK SIF financing perhaps speaks to the implementation challenges. How can our countries and how can the bank assist our member states to overcome some of those challenges?
Well, there are numerous factors that play into a project being delayed in terms of starting, from the funds being approved to the project being designed, including even the consultants being able to deliver the feasibility study in a timely manner. And also we found that in country, especially when we speak about consultancies, there is, I don't want to use the word there are some weak areas in terms of consultants being able to execute projects. And this also includes climate vulnerability assessments. But the feasibility study stage, which is usually the first part of the project to inform the rest of the project in terms of design and feasibility, this should normally, it can take between 6 months to 12 months, 6 to 12 months. And sometimes with countries, in terms of data availability, countries have to have the necessary data to feed into these feasibility studies. And we find that that is one of the critical issues. So as the NIP's new strategy, infrastructure strategy, it speaks to having an evidence-based approach. And this is, as I said, very critical. So when a consultant comes on board and has to get this information and it's not available, you have to start from the beginning. That is collecting the data. And this includes data pertaining to the demographics, the social aspects, economic aspects, down to doing surveys for the road, and collecting the necessary hydrology information, the geotechnical information, and sometimes these things are deficient or absent. And the project that you would have slated as being 6 to 12 months can run all the way into 18 months. And that's just a feasibility study. And then when you move into the capital works, trying to get the right contractor procured is another challenge. And COVID presented a special challenge for St. Lucia at this point in time, especially when it came to electronic submissions, making sure that the government has the necessary policies in place to receive even bids electronically. All of these were little challenges as we went along. But the government of St. Lucia was up to the challenge, and the project should start on the ground in early 2021. But those are a series of the challenges that we face.
Thank you for that explanation. Mr. Felix, the National Infrastructure Assessment Report given a lot more prominence with some of what Ms. Griffith just said.
Right, so one of the components of the report is the spatial analysis of infrastructure asset. And with the 4 hazard scenarios that we've mapped out on the QGIS platform that we have, we're able to see hazardous areas across the island. And that ties in with what Ms. Griffith was saying. The location it should be a factor in terms of how you insure assets, and also adding to what Mr. Branford was saying. So we do have the spatial analysis of St. Lucia and what hazards they're exposed to. The good thing about our model is that it's reactive. We can actually, it's not dormant, it's not static. We can actually improve on that model once the data is available. So we were able to use data that existed from 2016 from CHARIM. There was a project, CHARIM project, Caribbean Handbook on Risk Management, that was launched in 2016. So we used a lot of that base data to layer this on one single map that we could look at all the hazards on one screen, basically. So it's a tool that we have that we can use. It might help in the process, like Sharon said, the environmental impact assessment. That's a fairly lengthy process, and if we have that base data available, it can help improve on that process a bit. So we do have that within the NIP, and we are trained to use it. Happy to say our staff members are well equipped to look at that aspect of infrastructure financing.
A lot of approval there from Barbados, from Mrs. Griffith. Nice to see. We take
or NIP and any government agency. It's all wonderful to have these tools, have these softwares, and have the base data. But it's also equally important to maintain it and to have the necessary staff to take it beyond the year 2020. I have worked in Ministry of Works in Bahamas and Barbados and collaborated with Trinidad and realized that, say today you get the software, the person gets promoted to another department, and only one person was trained, and the software, nobody knows how to operate the software, and the data is not updated. And along comes CDB, World Bank, or somebody, and everybody's scrambling, trying to get a project going. So they need to make sure that more than one person is trained on a tool or a piece of software, and to ensure that the data is kept current is very important to that level of readiness to get the projects done within a timely manner.
The director of the NIP, Mr. Wells, from all indications, he appreciates and has registered that very important point. We take a question from the audience.
Good afternoon, Janai Leos, Chief Economist in the Department of Finance. Earlier you would have indicated that roughly 80% of the households are somewhat residential and therefore a bit outside of the scope of where this discussion has gone so far. Speaking about resilience and sustainability, I want to bring the issue of cost back on the table, and given that we have architects and engineers and sort of in the same room, it'll be an interesting time to ask the question. If you look at the income of the typical earner, the home that they can afford is in the region of $250,000 to $300,000. but the vast majority of, whether it be single family homes or what have you, is not within that range and is closer to a $400,000 number. How do you bridge that gap and the sustainability gap? Because even if individuals are able to afford, they may engineer out, as one of the panelists indicated earlier, some of what is deemed sustainable, because some of what is deemed sustainable may have an additional cost. So how do you get a home at a value that the average citizen can afford, and what we define as a home is something that is sustainable and resilient? So how do we square those two things?
Okay, I think it's important to note that what a lot of people may assume to be expensive usually isn't. A lot of the time it is just more trouble for the contractor. So a contractor will sometimes advise them, not to bother with this or that. Something, as I said, like rainwater reuse is actually not very expensive at all. You're running one extra run of pipe from your tank to your toilet, that sort of thing. But again, it's the education. Sorry? Oh. Yeah, it's the education, and it's the basically educating the public about these things. What is expensive, what is not. In terms of the overall cost of a house, for example, this is another misconception with the public, that if you get an architect to design a house, they will design something expensive for you. No, an architect will design what you require them to design, what you ask them to design. If you ask an architect to design, I have designed 1,000 square foot homes. I've designed 3,000. I've designed 1,005. I've designed 800 square foot homes already. I design what it is the client is looking for. Now, when I design a home for someone on a limited budget, I will still suggest to them that they use certain sustainable concepts in their home. Simple things like the type of lighting they use will save them in the long run. And really and truly, as you say, okay, $50,000 someone might turn up their nose at. But if you're going to spend $15,000 extra to reuse your rainwater, I think that is very reasonable, and I think most people will go for it. So I don't think that people understand just how easy it is to become more sustainable with their home design. And it goes back again to using professionals. You use engineers, you use architects. The gentleman from the insurers had mentioned that if a home may be designed for hurricane but not for earthquake. But if you have an engineer design your home, it should be designed to earthquake specs. Okay? So as long as you have a professional on it, you should already have a product that will stand up. All professionals in St. Lucia have liability for their designs. So if an insurance company says that they want to ensure that your home is hurricane resistant or earthquake resistant, all you have to do is check to see if there is a professional involved in the design. If there is, then he already has liability. He is to ensure that it can stand up to earthquake or hurricane. And I think as well, in terms of the cost of construction of residences, and it's not just residences, commercial buildings as well, supply in the region is a big problem. Supply of sustainable materials, yes, recycled materials is almost non-existent in the Caribbean. I mean, the cost of bringing in recycled materials to use on a project outweighs I mean, if you even think about it, trying to bring in recycled material is increasing your carbon footprint because now you have to pay a ship that uses fossil fuels to get it to St. Lucia. So until we reach a stage down here where we have recycled materials being used and things, we are missing out on a part of the sustainable line, But I honestly believe that a well-designed home will be done within the budget and to the requirements necessary.
One more question from the audience.
Okay, let me just ask quickly. In terms of resilience and building with resilience, I know in Dominica, Dominica has claimed that they're now building with greater resilience, buildings with concrete roofs. Are we pushing this agenda in St. Lucia? And in terms of disaster risk, is it something that St. Lucia is encouraging, that when we build, we don't build with the type of roofing that we have now, and we have greater levels of resilience built into our homes? I don't know who's going to take it.
Can I start off? Because one thing you mentioned there is building resilient with concrete roofs. Having a concrete roof doesn't mean that your house is more resilient. In Dominica, in Grenada, in Ivan, in a lot of these situations, there were lots of examples of timber structures designed by professionals that stood up when the concrete houses around them fell down. All right, so it's all about how it is designed, how it is built. If it is built to the specifications of a good design, you're generally safe. Okay, I mean, I know in Ivan, for example, I had seen examples of timber houses, complete timber from the ground up, that only lost a fascia board, you know, and they were sometimes the only building in the community left standing, you know. So it's all about design and supervision during construction is key, and it's not happening in the region.
Branford, you can add?
Yeah, just let me add a bit. While we focus on the building costs of a house, we have to take into consideration that the operating cost is also a factor. And some of the houses that were built years ago, you would probably see persons have run all electrical lines so they can light up the fence, they can light up the driveway. But now we have a different market now, and your driveway can actually be lit up with solar lights. So you're actually using less energy to operate the house. So in building now, the architects, engineers have to become a little more innovative, and where you can actually get the same house at 300,000, but is equipped with a lot of climate adaptation areas. So you have this fancy house, but for 6 months, 5 months, there was no rain, right? There's no rain, and you have all of your house dependent on electrical power. So there is no enjoyment there because you have no rainwater harvesting capacity in your house. You have not built for climate change. So with climate change now will come the new shift in terms of how architects design and construct and build the houses, as well as the threat of disasters. You mentioned about resilience. It's important that most of the households now, and especially Mr. Chamberlain mentioned about the building codes, if those building codes have not been upgraded, all it means is that the government now has to respond to more social issues after disaster. More persons have lost their homes, and more businesses have lost the structure. More bridges have gone with the flood, and so you find that the country has to be rebuilt all over again. So it's important that the resilience of those structures remain something that can withstand certain disasters, as to mitigate the entire costs to the country, because at the end of the day, every single impact of that disaster is calculated, and it's read into what you call the country's growth rate, the country's GDP, the country's level of economic activity, the country's capacity to get to exactly where it was prior to the disaster. So it's important that we build resilience in all aspects of our infrastructure.
Just a quick signal to our producers that we just take one more question from the audience, and we wrap up.
My name is Humphrey Regis, and I'm the engineer attached to the architectural section of the Department of Physical Planning. You know, just looking at the motto of NIP, evidence-based infrastructure, and considering the size of our island, one could essentially say that infrastructural security is national security, and many folks have the idea that because we're a volcanic island, that you know, you could take any rocks anywhere. But I always tell people, being a volcanic island is not necessarily a blueprint for having the greatest rocks. I mean, as we know, Volcano Central, Soufrière has the most variety but the worst rocks. And is there any part in your report in the infrastructure plan where you guys actually gave precedence to designated quarry areas? I know the Department of Physical Planning was on some geological, some form of guidelines for that, considering our largest area of basalt, which is basically the prime material, is considered in the south. Is there any provision made where the government could actually assist? Because sometimes one may have a quarry with the best material, but around that quarry, those lands may be, you know, maybe controlled by some other person. Is there a plan to actually create, let's say, as I say, infrastructure security is national security? And the second part is, after Thomas, we had one could arguably say that St. Lucia was a geotechnical engineering lab, literally speaking. We had all types of failures, shallow failures, deep-seated failures. We had all types of failures, and I was thinking that, you know, it would give us a chance to go into the area of geosynthetics within our construction. One of the prime areas is where we could actually use geogrid and geotextile in our road foundations. What it will decrease the thickness of the road base, which is financially viable for us, and also prolonging the life of the road. Is there any provisions made for actually going at, like, guidelines for the geotechnical area, geosynthetics rather, and the quarry geological part?
I'll firstly answer simply, no and no, and then I'll delve and try to dissect what you're trying to find out about. So the first question about the quarry and the location of the quarries and looking at national security in terms of assets, scarce resources, that should actually come with a land use plan, which we do not have. So the allocation of resources, or the preservation of resources for future use, that's something that has to come out of a national land use plan and a zoning plan. And that, from my understanding, is an exercise that's happening. I'm not sure when it will be done, but it's something that we need to do as of yesterday. Because as you may know, there's all our ideal lands are being taken up by other uses that's not tying in with the national development plans. So we have squatting happening, unplanned development. We have businesses taking away prime land, housing, residential land. So we have a lot happening in St. Lucia that we need to take charge of as soon as possible. The second part to your question, in terms of the geotechnical features or the geotechnical aspect in terms of our resources, our underground resources, we did not look at that in this report. This would require a lot of resources and a lot of time to delve into the geotechnical aspects of our soils. I mean, looking at earthquakes, and you mentioned Soufrière, to look at response spectrums for various locations in St. Lucia, that will take years. Even though it's 238 square miles, you know, different soil type, different rock types will have different responses based on the earthquake or the seismic activities. So that's a whole exercise. Sorry to be a little technical to our viewers, but my simple answer to Humphrey is no. We've not looked at that. Hopefully, these are very important things that we need to look at. Again, it ties into national security. We need to have the data to help developers to understand our land and our geography better. In that way, it will take less time for them to develop these environmental impact assessments, and development will be better executed, better planned. So that's my response to it.
Thank you, Mr. Fabian Felix, and thank you to you, members of the audience who asked questions. I'm sure we all can agree that because of the quality of the discussion, we can go on for another 2 hours, but the platform just doesn't allow us the opportunity to do it on this occasion. To end, we allow our panelists 1 final minute to deliver your closing remarks, and we'll start off with Mr. Jamal Francis.
start on the back end going forward now. All right, so I'd like to close off with the remark that I think one of the major challenges we're going to face in the region, even before water shortage, is land shortage. I believe that a national land use policy is definitely something that needs to be developed day before yesterday. I believe that we need to start pushing for more sustainable designs in terms of reusing land that is already developed, saving our virgin lands. I agree with Humphrey that we need to identify areas that we can use to produce aggregate. Because if you look at St. Vincent right now is importing almost all of its aggregate. They're completely out of aggregate. So, yeah, I think that I just wanted to close with that comment that land use, land shortage, I think, is going to be one of our major issues in St. Lucia, especially when we have developers using up such large swaths of land all over the place. And I will just throw one final comment in there about insurance, and that is that architects generally have always designed for sustainability. From the time sustainable design was thought up, architects were at the head of it. One of the major issues in St. Lucia is that majority of projects on island are not designed by architects or engineers.
Thank you for those very frank closing remarks, Mr. Jamal Francis. He is the president of the Institute of Architects right here in St. Lucia and the director at the Design House, which is a consultant firm specializing in architecture, mechanical engineering, and electrical engineering. Providing excellent representation to the NIP team on this afternoon's panel, we now invite Mr. Fabian Felix to deliver his closing remarks.
I'd like to close by saying there is a cost associated with resilience. We cannot expect individual persons who build in their 1,000 square feet houses to factor in resilience into their designs because cost, of course, is a factor and it's tied into resilience. And that ties in with the question Janai asked. I think it has to go further than the individual. Governments within the region have to take the bull by the horn, and they have to act on resilience and ensure that the projects that they implement are resilient and they're able to transfer that knowledge to the individual on the ground level. Without that, we will not be able to achieve our sustainable development goals by 2030. So governments must act, organizations must act. Until they do not, they've not acted, individual persons like myself who build in or who plan to build a house, we will not factor in resilience into our designs. That's my closing remark.
Lead from the top. Mr. Fabian Felix, quality contributions on this afternoon's panel. I'd like to move across now to our acting accountant general. Given his grasp of the issues, I'm unsure as to why he's still acting, but we'll now take in the final remarks from him. Mr. Matthew Branford.
Yeah, my final remarks, I just want to reiterate that the Caribbean and the close countries, we are always going to be exposed to risks. And it's important that we understand the implication of those risks on our financial resources in the country. So it's important that persons plan, understand, and budget for risk and make the necessary allocations, both from a household point of view and business point of view, to make the necessary allocation to be able to mitigate and to finance those risks. While we have a disaster risk financing strategy, these tools are not exhaustive, and the Ministry of Finance will continue to build and to focus on various instruments to be able to fight risks on a sovereign level to keep the country on a sustainable path. I want to also indicate that we are still learning from the past, and we are still trying to improve on our various risk mitigation measures. However, I'd like to identify some stakeholders that is also part of the risk strategy which is the Office of the Prime Minister, NEMO, WASCO, Solid Waste Management, and all the other entities that come together, and and the architects as well, also in the strategy of helping to build resilience infrastructure to mitigate our risk. So finally, I just want to say again that the Ministry of Finance will continue its fight to ensure that the impact is mitigated on the budget. As we know, COVID has stretched the budget a bit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Matthew Branford, and we wish you and your team all the best in the formalization of that disaster risk financial strategy. He's no stranger to the discussion on resilience. We now have the closing remarks from Mr. Chamberlain Emmanuel.
Thank you so much, and it was a pleasure to be on the panel to contribute and also to learn of all the excellent work being done by the various departments in the government of St. Lucia. Let me just close by saying that there's actually a strange parallel between what's happening right now with COVID and how we really should see resilience. Resilience should really be everybody's business and really in our DNA. With the COVID situation, there is a role for institutions or government, but there is also a critical role for personal responsibility. And if some are not engaged, then the entire thing falls apart. Therefore, with resilience, yes, government has its role to play, yes, institutions, but the common person, I really want to end by appealing to the common person that, it matters, if you pay attention and if you comply and if you try to employ best practices, because at the end of the day, it affects us as individuals. When you spend your hard-earned monies, whether you go to the bank or use your savings, it's really you. So you need to pay attention to what your contractor is doing, ensure that, you get the best design, ensure that, you get the best material. It comes down, at the end of the day, all policy impacts individuals. And if all of us are interested and we do our part, then it forces the institutions to do what they need to do. At the OCS Commission, we have been able to assist. Many of our member states piloted many models. Somebody spoke about land use plans, etc. We have assisted many of our member states, and I think if we can customize those to St. Lucia once powers that be are willing, and we can help you to get it further. Thank you so much.
Excellent, Mr. Emmanuel. Today I know we focused a lot on resilience at the national level, but perhaps for round two, Mr. Wells, we could take the discussion to the domestic and speak to our citizens across the region as to what they can do with garbage disposal, the harvesting of wastewater, where we build, etc. That's perhaps something that we could look forward to. The only female on this afternoon's panel, the rose amongst thorns. We now move across to Barbados once more for the closing remarks from Ms. Sharon Griffith. Your mic is muted, I'm told, Mrs. Griffith.
The joys of technology. As I was saying, an integrated approach is required, with the process being driven from the top and having champions and a high level of commitment to building resilience. So this comes from the policy, the strategies, and the action plans, and having resilience built in as a common driving thread, and ensuring that all voices, including our architects, all voices are heard in the development of these policy strategies and even in the implementation processes. The CDB reiterates its commitment to providing that level of financing and also technical assistance in helping all of our board member countries build more resilience and stronger resilience from economic, social, and environmental standpoint.
Thank you, Mrs. Griffith, and we look forward to the continued support and backing of our institution, the Caribbean Development Bank, as we look to improve resilience amongst our borrowing member states. A round of applause for our panelists this afternoon. This brings us to the end of this panel discussion. On behalf of the producers and the organizers, the National Integrated Planning and Program Unit, the technical support provided And on behalf of our panelists this afternoon, my name is Shannon LeBon, saying thank you so much for being a part of this panel discussion. I leave you with this thought, that an investment in resilience is not costly, but it pays. Until next time, I'm Shannon LeBon saying bye-bye for now.
COVID-19 has been disastrous for our economy and our productivity.
But it has caused us to reset, rethink, and innovate.
Productivity Awareness Week 2020 will focus on building collective structure and the financial sector.
Rethink our approach to the agriculture, manufacturing, and the health sector.
It calls for innovation in education and taking advantage of opportunities in the digital economy.
Telework for greater resilience and productivity.
Join the discussions during Productivity Awareness Week from October 12th to the 16th.
Under the theme, Building Resilience Through Collective Action.
Reset, rethink,
innovate.
Join the discussions live on Facebook at St. Lucia, NCPC, the National Competitiveness and Productivity Council, embracing excellence.